You've seen it 1,000 times in movies and video games, right? The American Marine, deep in the jungle, pumping away with a shotgun, just leveling everything in his path. It's the ultimate close quarters weapon, the one that supposedly terrified the Japanese. But what if I told you that whole story is mostly a myth? Well, today we're going to dig into the reality behind one of the biggest legends of the Pacific War. So, let's put ourselves there for a second. Picture the jungles of a place like Guadalcanal. It is hot, it's suffocatingly humid, you can barely see 10 feet in front of your face, and the enemy is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Now, into that nightmare scenario, the U.S. Marines bring what sounds like the perfect tool for the job, the pump-action shotgun, a weapon literally designed for one thing: overwhelming, brutal firepower, up close and personal. And right here, this is where it gets weird. I mean, if this was the perfect weapon for that kind of fight, you'd expect its impact to be legendary, right? So, was it? Was it really the game changer we all think it was? Or is there something else going on here? That is the question we're here to answer. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll dive into the legend of the Hollywood trench gun. Then, we'll see why Japan's own military thinking left them wide open to it. After that, we uncover a fatal flaw in the weapon system. Then we'll look at its real, much smaller role. And finally, we'll ask the big question: why does this myth still have such a powerful grip on us? Okay, first up, let's build the legend, because you've got to understand the myth before you can bust it. In the Pacific, ambushes happened in a flash. You're walking a trail and suddenly the jungle erupts. The idea of a weapon that could just fill a space with lead, well, it didn't just seem useful, it seemed absolutely essential. And the trench gun, which already had this fearsome reputation from World War I, seemed like it was made for this moment. And the core of that legend was a feature called slam fire. Now think about this. A Marine could just hold the trigger down, and every time he worked that pump, bang! He could empty 6 shells of buckshot, a literal wall of lead, in about 2 seconds. That is an insane rate of fire, faster than pretty much any other infantry weapon out there at the time. And get this, each one of those shells was packed with 9 lead pellets. That's basically like firing 9 pistol rounds at the exact same time. You know, in the pure chaos of a jungle ambush, you don't have time to line up a perfect shot. With this, you just had to point in the right direction. It was nicknamed the jungle broom for a reason. It was supposed to just sweep everything out of the way. So let's flip the script and look at this from the Japanese perspective. The Imperial Japanese Army, they were meticulous. They studied their enemies. They had plans for dealing with American rifles, machine guns, you name it. But the shotgun? To them, that wasn't a weapon of war. That was something you used to hunt ducks. It wasn't even on their radar. You have to understand, Japanese military doctrine was built on this concept of seishin, or spiritual power. They genuinely believed that the warrior spirit, the will to fight, could overcome any material disadvantage. This all culminated in the Banzai Charge, a wave of soldiers with bayonets fixed. The shotgun is the polar opposite of that. It's not about spirit, it's about brutal, mechanical, overwhelming force. It's the perfect answer to a tactic that relies on sheer courage and cold steel. Okay, so we've just built this perfect picture, right? The perfect weapon against the perfect target in the perfect environment. And right here, this is where the whole story starts to fall apart. Because if this thing was so incredible, so decisive, why don't the guys who were actually there ever talk about it? You read these incredibly detailed memoirs from Marines like Eugene Sledge or Robert Leckie, and the shotgun is just gone. It's a ghost. And that silence is our first big clue that something is wrong with the legend. And now, we get to the real heart of the matter. See, the shotgun had an Achilles heel, and the enemy that found it wasn't the Japanese army. It was the jungle itself. The problem wasn't the gun, it was the ammo. You see, back then, shotgun shells were made of paper. Just paper and brass. Well, in the 100% humidity of the Pacific, those paper hulls acted like sponges. They just soaked up all that moisture and would physically swell. A shell that you could load just fine in the morning would be so swollen by the afternoon that you couldn't even get it into the chamber. So in the heat of battle, your terrifying weapon could instantly become a very heavy, very useless club. And the crazy part is, this wasn't a secret. They knew about this problem from the very start of the campaign, on Guadalcanal back in 1942. But the Thix, an all-brass shell that moisture couldn't touch, it wasn't officially adopted until the very end of March 1945. By that point, the war was basically over. For almost the entire duration of the Pacific War, the shotgun was just fundamentally unreliable. So if it wasn't this widespread jungle-clearing superweapon we all imagine, what was it actually for? Well, it did have a job, but it was a very, very specific role for a small number of guys.
Let's just look at the numbers. A Marine division had hundreds of shotguns authorized, sure, but that was less than 2% of all their small arms. It was never meant to be a standard issue weapon like the M1 rifle. It was a specialist tool, and it was handed out very carefully for very specific missions.
And those missions were pretty unglamorous compared to the movies. It was perfect for the point man on a patrol, the first guy in line who needed to react instantly. It was used for guarding the perimeter at night, when you couldn't see well and the spread of buckshot was a real advantage. And it was used a lot for guarding prisoners. All important jobs for sure, but not exactly the stuff of Hollywood legend.
And I think this quote from a Marine who was actually on Guadalcanal just says it all perfectly. The shotgun was good for what it was good for, but when a real fight broke out, when you had enemies at different ranges, you wanted a rifle. You wanted the range, the accuracy, and the rock-solid reliability of your M1 Garand.
So this brings us to the final and maybe most interesting question. If the shotgun was actually rare, often unreliable, and used in these very specific roles, why is it remembered as this icon of the Pacific? Well, this is where the story stops being about history and starts being about, well, storytelling.
Look, the most powerful evidence for its real role is actually the lack of evidence. It's the sound of silence. The Japanese wrote detailed reports on how to counter flamethrowers and machine guns, but nothing about the shotgun. The most famous memoirs don't mention it. The U.S. Army never did a study on its effectiveness. And here's the kicker. In World War I, the Germans formally protested the use of the shotgun as inhumane. The Japanese, in World War II, not a peep. They didn't complain about it because, frankly, it just wasn't a big enough deal to them. So where did the legend come from? It wasn't born in the jungles of the Pacific. It was born on the silver screen in Hollywood. Post-war movies, and then decades later video games, they latched onto this incredibly powerful image of a Marine with a trench gun. It's cinematic, it's dramatic, and it tells a really simple story about American firepower. It just doesn't happen to be true. And in the end, the story of the Pacific War shotgun isn't really about a gun at all, is it? It's a perfect example of how military myths get started. It shows us how the messy, complicated, and often pretty boring reality of war gets sanded down and polished into a much cleaner, more exciting story. A story that feels true, even when the facts say something else.
The shotgun myth is just such a compelling story that we want it to be real, but the evidence just isn't there. And that really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? What other facts about history that we all take for granted are actually just really, really good stories that we've all sort of agreed to believe in?